So how many people belong to this august organization?
Got 110 on the mailing list.
Wow.
And I'd say Sunday nights usually about 20, 30.
Wow.
Like that.
Great.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just give a quick introduction. This is Professor Roger Noll. He's a professor of economics emeritus, and he's also with the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. He's done a lot of work in sports economics and antitrust law, and on campus he's also been involved with the faculty senate, I believe.
Oh, many times, yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the advantages of being retired. You don't have to serve on it anymore.
And he was in the headlines over the summer quite a bit for being and the expert witness for Ed O'Bannon in that trial this summer with the NCAA. So that's certainly something that you can ask him about when he's done with his presentation. So thank you for being here. Yeah, we really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad to see this organization coming into existence. It's about time. So what's the distribution of majors here? I bet, here, let me guess. How many are in computer science? Nobody? How many in economics? Nobody. That's wonderful. So tell me what your majors are.
Oh, actually, PhD. Yeah. So economics. I didn't have. I didn't have time to raise my hand.
Economics. Slow. Admission standards have gotten lower in the department.
Electrical engineering.
Operations research.
Math.
Simsys.
I'm sorry?
Symbolic systems.
Symbolic systems. Great.
Math. Engineering, not sure. Refreshment.
Ah, okay. So I still may be right about you.
Bioengineering.
Structural engineering. Philosophy. There you go. Yeah.
And I'm statistics.
Great. Well, I was a math major as an undergraduate, and so I'm sympathetic with about half of you. I didn't become interested in economics until the end of my junior year of college, which is illustrative of the point people have told you all along, which is your choice of undergraduate major doesn't matter a great deal, because once you get into it, you discover a whole different world than you thought existed when you were in high school. What I want to talk about tonight is the history of the use of statistical methodology of one form or another in studying sports, and contrast that with the things that you hear about. All right, and indeed, in the latter category, if you go to a normal human being group, not Stanford, but just sort of wander out among people in the community, they only know really, if they know anything, they only know two things, right? The first thing is they know Bill James invented sabermetrics, and the second thing they know is that Billy Beane invented econometric models to evaluate players. Both of those well-known facts are false, and that's part of the reason I'm structuring the talk as I am, and not to undermine their role. They both did really important stuff, but there's a great deal more to the story than that. So what I'm going to do is start with Billy Beane and Moneyball, and sort of describe roughly not what they did, but what the problem is. All right, and the problem is my owner has just given me a budget, and my task is to field the best possible team I can with that budget, and noting that my budget is 1/3 of the Yankees and 2/3 or less of the average for all of Major League Baseball. So I'm going to get fired if I don't win half my games and make it at least plausible I'm going to be in the pennant race till near the end of the season. I'm going to get fired, and I've got to do it with less resources than my competitors. How can I solve that problem? And the traditional answer to that was hire a lot of old retired baseball players to go around to high school and college baseball games and tell you who the best prospects are. And they will do so with their eyeballs. And there will be no way to know whether they actually know what they're talking about until several years after the fact. You'll pay them a salary in year T, and then in year T plus 10, you'll know whether their recommendations actually amounted to anything. And of course, by T plus 10, you're fired if it hasn't worked. So it's not a very good way to approach the general manager problem if you're running a sports team, is to evaluate players purely on the basis of that information. And that's the nutshell of what gives rise to the use of statistical methodology in sports. Now, what do you have to do to beat the scout? Now, I might add that this doesn't mean you throw away the scouts. This means you supplement the scouts to the degree that it makes sense with other information that is more objective and more testable. All right, and the problem is not just the Bill James problem. Now, what is the Bill James problem? The Bill James problem is, how do we aggregate all the playing statistics in a sport? Because every sport has numerous measures of playing effectiveness. You think of all the different ways that you can measure the effectiveness of a player in any sport. There's huge numbers of them. And one of the important features of these playing statistics is that for a given position on the field or on a team, they're all very highly correlated. All right, that is to say, once I know one or two things in any sport about a player, I can't get much more information by knowing more than that. So the Bill James problem was essentially that problem, is let's devote, since we know these statistics tend to be highly correlated, let's figure out some combined metric using something like factor analysis or something like that to condense this wealth of player information into a couple of key statistics that will be good summary statistics of player quality. All right, and now that's not, you know, the way you do it is you focus on the outcome of a game, and you say, gee, how does the outcome of the game depend upon the player characteristics of the people in the game, and both on the one team and on the other, and you sort of regress the outcome of a game on the player characteristics of the two entities. And that's what Bill James was noted for, but he was by no means the first person to do it. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of that. And then once you got something like that, you're not really done, because if you get more sophisticated than the simple budget problem that I described, the budget itself becomes something that's determined by the econometric analysis. That is to say, how much your budget should be depends on the relationship between team revenues and team quality. So another component of the Billy Beane problem is he has to have not only the model that characterizes the quality of players, but he's also got to have the model that maps those characteristics into the revenues of the team. And so that's the Billy Beane problem. So now let's go back and discuss how we got to Billy Beane. We got to Billy Beane, a necessary step along the way was Bill James. But it was insufficient, it was incomplete, there had to be more. And so I want to talk about how we got there and where we're going, because the where we're going part is more interesting. Now I'm going to switch to computer science. All right, complete change. And I want to take you back 50 years, which, you know, to you, that seems like I'm going all the way back to the dinosaurs. But 50 years is the relevant time horizon. In the early 1960s, the Harvard Computer Center, where I was a graduate student, it took approximately 24 hours to run a single 3-variable linear regression. The memory capacity of the computer was 512K, and the way you estimated regression was, first of all, condensing variables to a group of moments of summary statistics, because the computer itself wasn't really capable of absorbing large numbers of data observations and analyzing them and producing a result. So for those of you who know something about regression analysis, basically what you have to do regression analysis is invert matrices of data. And inverting a matrix of raw data, if you have lots of observations, as you can imagine, in Major League Baseball you have 20 or so measures of player statistics, and you have 30 teams with the number of players who will actually come to bat for a team in a year is about 40. So you have 30 times 40 players, observations on 20 variables. It would take most of your life using the Harvard Computer Center in the early 1960s to be able to produce a regression that would summarize for you the crucial playing statistics and tell you how those playing statistics feed into the won-loss percentage of a team. So it just wasn't feasible. You just couldn't do it. And one of the interesting facts of life that's true about economics, it's true about other social sciences, it's true about the natural sciences. Thanks to Moore's law, which is the rate of technological progress in semiconductors, we transformed ourselves from data analysis is essentially impossible in 1960 to, by 1985, I can do anything I want. I can have millions of data points. All right. Now, it's even better than that now. To give you a sense of, I had a term paper when I was a graduate student at Harvard 50 years ago, in which the idea was using a state as a unit of observation to estimate the party composition of votes in the presidential election in that state as a function of the economic conditions in the state and a couple of other things. It took me approximately 3 weeks to run that regression. 3 weeks, all right? 50 states and 3 independent variables. All right, it just took forever. And of course, you know, you put in your data, you had to get it there by noon in order to get any computer output by the end of business on the next day. And of course, you always make a mistake. So the very first thing you discover is that there's some coding error, that Colorado suddenly has a population of 63 billion because you've mispunched the cards. You had to punch paper cards. You stick in a deck of paper cards, this thick, and it'd take you 5 or 6 times before you would get all the data right, and then 5 or 6 more times before you get the computer code right, because you had to write all your own programs. There was no off-the-shelf statistical software. You couldn't pull down a statistical package off the shelf and run a regression. You had to write the code to do it. And so, of course, you make lots of mistakes there. And so 2 weeks into it, you finally got a data set that's clean and a program that works. But then, of course, you have to test different specifications. Is it linear? Is it log linear? You know, do I do this, that, or, you know, do I have to? What kind of error correction routines do I need to write to deal with all these problems? And so, 3 weeks later, you have a simple regression. You know, vote share of Democrats in state X equals A plus B unemployment rate plus C rate of economic growth since the last election plus D partisan composition of registration. That simple regression took me about half of a quarter to run and then write up. Well, that is the world we operate in at the time we first start studying sports, right? Where it's almost impossible to do anything. But rapid advances in computer technology keep adding to how much you could do. And the very first breakthrough is by a guy named Jerry Scully, who was at that time a professor at the University of Texas. And he is the first person who managed to estimate an equation that would predict a player's wages on the basis of their playing characteristics. And he is the person who actually discovered that once you get past 2 or 3 playing characteristics, you're done. that you can't add any more explanatory power to the model by adding additional playing characteristics. So his first paper was written about baseball, and his model was incredibly simple. For pitchers, it was the power pitching ratio. For hitters, it was the slugging average, and he couldn't find any variables to add to that equation. He had position and either batting average and batting average for the position players, and he had power pitching ratio for the pitchers, and that was it. And he was able to explain a very large fraction of the variance in wages. But notice how important this is, because what does that equation do for you? It capsulizes for you the qualitative methods that teams are using to evaluate players. The scouting system. What you're actually recovering is the information that the general manager has in negotiating player salaries, and because the general manager is going to look at the performance characteristics. And there are going to be other things he may take into account, like the attitude, whether the person is damaging to his team. But the vast majority of athletes are not. The vast majority of athletes are just sort of normal people. And so other things that might matter are not important in the grand scheme of things. So somewhere in the back of the general manager's mind are these evaluations that we don't know how he gets to them, but we do know that he signs contracts with players, and the players have agents, and there's a wage in them. And lo and behold, you can explain almost all the variance among players and wages in this simple equation. And that's really crucial, because that's your starting point. That is your starting point. Then, a few years later, both Scully, in additional work, and another economist named Andrew Zimbalist, who's a professor at Smith College, comes up with the notion that, you know, we can match this wage equation to a revenue equation that's based on the same playing statistics. Oh, this is a bit more cumbersome, because it's the team's collective playing statistics that matter, and of course an individual only contributes to that in proportion to what fraction of the at-bats does this individual account for, or what fraction of the innings pitched does this pitcher account for. Well, now we're at the precursors of Bill James, right? Because what's going on here is, how do we aggregate individual player statistics into a team quality? And then how do we use the team quality to estimate revenue? And what does this get you when you do it? You can address the question, if I use this player instead of the minimum quality player in the major league, how much additional revenue do I get? That's exactly the Bill James problem. What is the contribution of this player beyond the worst player, you know, who's still in the major leagues, or the best player who's playing in AAA? What is you have the best available substitute who isn't already there, and the contribution of a player is the increment to playing statistics over that baseline accounted for by this player, and then you regress that against revenues, and you get a direct link. In economics, we call this the player's marginal revenue product. Now, this comes about in the academic literature at roughly the same time that baseball enters into salary arbitration. So now we'll go back and we'll tell a story with a Stanford connection. All right, Stanford had a really great safety on the football team a few years ago. It's a little too far back for you probably to remember, but his name was McNally. And he came here as a walk-on, but he became the starting safety, and he was really, really good. All right, and I happened to be fortunate that I was the faculty person who was designated to talk to him on his recruiting visit, because Stanford, unlike every other school in the country, actually has students recruited by faculty. Our peers do not, and for reasons that are obvious. So in talking to him, I said, you know, McNally, are you related to Dave? And he said, yeah, that happens to be my father. Dave McNally is one of the most important people in the history of baseball. He was a terrific pitcher for Baltimore, but his claim to fame was that Dave McNally and another pitcher for the Dodgers, Andy Messersmith, 1 year refused to sign an extension of their player contract, a 1-year renewal of their player contract. And under the collective bargaining agreement, which says contract disputes will be subject to arbitration, McNally and Messersmith claimed before the arbitrator that after they played this 1-year renewal, that they should be free agents. They should be allowed to play for any team they want at any salary they can negotiate, because that is the plain meaning of the contract they hold, which is that the team has the right to renew the contract. The position of Major League Baseball is that this is a perpetual right. I can renew this contract all I want. If you don't sign it this year, I'll renew it for next year. And then if I've unilaterally renewed it, I'll renew it for another year if you don't sign. The way Major League Baseball arbitration works, and still works today, and the way arbitration in other sports works as well, because other sports have adopted arbitration to resolve disputes, is that the player nominates one member of a 3-person arbitration panel. The owner nominates one person on a 3-person arbitration panel. And then those two pick the third person, who is selected from a roster of potential arbitrators that is collectively bargained between the union and the owners. Many of you know Bill Gould. Bill Gould's a professor in the law school. He was also, at one point in his career, the chairman of the National Labor Relations Board, which is the regulatory body that regulates collective bargaining. Well, Bill was also an arbitrator. He was on this list of people who could negotiate, and they would be the deciding vote, because every decision is 2-to-1, right? It's the chair who decides for the player or for the owner. And so the Messersmith-McNally case goes to this arbitration panel, and the relevant person is a man named Peter Seitz, who is a long-time negotiator in collective bargaining. And Seitz rules that contract doesn't say it's perpetually renewable, therefore it isn't. And therefore McNally and Messersmith are free agents. Well, once that happens, all hell breaks loose, because now every single person in Major League Baseball, as soon as their contract expires, they can play 1 more year and then they're free agents. All right. So a whole new collective bargaining structure has to be initiated. And arbitration, the scope of arbitration expands. The final result of the collective bargaining is, and this is similar to other sports, by the way, is that when you enter the sport, the team that drafts you has a certain number of years when you can't play for anybody else. You must negotiate just with that team. Then there's another period at which your salary can be determined by arbitration. And then there's another period when, if you've gone past that, you're just a free agent. Now, there are other technical details about this, and the sports differ in the relative importance of arbitration. But that's the essence of it. So once arbitration comes into existence, then you have the following problem. Let's go back to baseball, where the process originated. I played for 3 years, so now I'm eligible for arbitration. I'm not eligible for free agency for 3 more years. So I've got a 3-year window when my salary is determined by an arbitrator. How does the arbitrator determine that salary? Well, the obvious answer is, how much are people paid who play at your level of skill? And so all this other work by a bunch of academic scribblers like me becomes important. And an entire consulting firm industry comes into existence. People who consult for owners and people who consult for baseball players, constructing salary regressions that say, this is how much this guy would be paid if his salary were negotiated in a market. And the data that are used to construct this equation are the salaries paid to free agents. All right? And they don't just stop at the wage equation. They go straight to the marginal revenue product. What is the contribution of this player to revenue? So I now have, I fast forward a few years, say I'm in 1980, and it's time for Reggie Jackson to negotiate a contract through arbitration or somebody like that, they would go to these regressions, they estimate these regressions about what is the contribution of a player of Reggie Jackson's skill compared to the best available player who isn't playing Major League Baseball. It would be his substitute. What is that contribution to revenue? And that's what he should be paid. And the way to estimate that is to take all the players and all the playing statistics and produce this regression of playing characteristics on revenues. That's all before Bill James. This is all before Bill James. We have already baked in to the structure of professional sports by the time Bill James comes along the idea that player salaries are going to be determined by econometric estimations of the contributions of players to the revenue of their team. Now, what Bill James does that's really cool is he vastly improves the inputs to this model on the player performance side. He does much more comprehensive and exhaustive analysis to come up with his sort of screwball. I'm sure you all know that Bill James screwball statistics, you know, about how do you measure the performance of a baseball player. That's his contribution, and his contribution is to add a little bit of precision to this fundamental process that's already estimating the contribution of the player to revenues. Now, I might add that arbitration is the window by which econometric analysis or statistical analysis is introduced into professional sports. But it's by no means limited to it, because there's absolutely no reason why only arbitration decisions should be based on this analysis. If you're the general manager of a baseball team, you want to know this for every single person on your team and everybody who you might sign to be on your team. A good deal, quote unquote, in baseball would be a player out there on the market that you can obtain. You can either trade for him or you can hire him as a free agent who is underpaid, who your little statistical model says this guy is worth X, but he's being paid X minus 10. So what a good deal. I'll buy him. All right. That's Billy Beane's contribution, is to take that next step, to use that same model that's used in the arbitration process, that was invented for the purpose of arbitration, souped up by the Bill James analysis, to identify the bargains in the free agency market. All right. Now, at the time, the A's were not the only team doing this. Contrary to the movie, it wasn't true that the A's were the only team doing this. And indeed, other teams were doing it, but they were not teams like the A's. All right. In fact, one of the teams that actually did it before the A's did it was the Yankees. But just think about what the model would say if you were the general manager of the Yankees instead of the general manager of the A's. It wouldn't be put together a scrappy little squad at 2/3 the average salary of all baseball teams and try to play 500 baseball. Because the revenue function for the Yankees is much more lucrative. All right? You put a 300 batter, I'm using that. Bear in mind, I really mean some fancy measure out of Bill James. But put a 300 hitter on the A's, generates an extra $1 million. Put a 300 hitter on the Yankees, generates an extra $20 million. All right, and so the solution to the problem, who should we hire, is completely different for the Yankees than it is for the A's. But of course, how the Yankees continue to field teams that are in the pennant race and that historically, if you take a 10-year period, dominate their league, that makes for much less riveting books and movies than how you take a team that has almost no fans and produce it into a contender. That's really exciting and makes a good movie. But that's why people who are sort of in the industry, and even Billy Beane himself, if you should invite him to come down here, because he actually wanted to come to Stanford. I don't know if you know this about Billy Beane.
It's in the movie.
Yeah, is it in the movie? He actually wanted to come to Stanford. So he would be happy to come to know you. But the point about it is, he also will say, you know, what I did was solve my problem for my team, but this was in the wind. Everybody was doing it. It was being introduced at the same time. But we're still not done yet, all right? That is to say, the implicit assumption in all this is that the playing statistics a player produces are somehow genetic, right? That is to say, when I hire player X, I'm hiring this batting average, this number of home runs, this number of RBIs, this number of stolen bases, this number of spectacular circus catches like Panic did last night. How many people watched the game? Great, you're not a bunch of effete East Coasters who refuse to watch it. That was a terrific game. I mean, I loved every minute of it. I thought it was terrific. I told Mark Marquez, the baseball coach, he said, "What do you think about the game?" And I said, "Well, my hope is that Jeremy Guthrie has a no-hitter through the 9th inning, but at the end of 9 it's a 0-0 tie, and in the top of the 10th, the Giants score 10 runs and win." After they pull Jeremy, and he's replaced by one of their many star relievers. Now, it's a terrific game. But the point is that you have these playing statistics, and so the idea of all these models, when we go all the way back to the very beginning of the Scully wage model, and then the marginal productivity model, and then the exploitation model, what's the difference between the wage this guy makes and how much he's actually worth? When we go back to all that, the entering wedge of it is that the playing statistics you're buying are natural constants, right? And then they may have statistical variance to them. It's not that, you know, they're random variables, but they're random variables with a mean that is given to you by nature. All right, it's sort of like buying a roulette wheel. You know, there's one roulette wheel out there that has a standard roulette wheel, and then there's another roulette wheel out there that has 20 extra 36s, right? And I'm going to pay more for the 20 extra 36s than for the one that has only one 36. But I'm still buying a roulette wheel of known characteristics. So when I buy a good player, I'm getting a better on-average outcome than when I buy a bad player. Well, we know that's wrong, right? And why do we know it's wrong? Anybody ever thought about why we know it's wrong?
Because we see it all the time, right?
How do we see it? What do we see it? How do we see it?
People get older and they perform.
Well, no, but that's just age, right? That's just the mean of the random variable is a function of age. What would we not observe if that were the way the world worked? We wouldn't observe coaches, right? We wouldn't observe trainers, right? We wouldn't all come to Stanford on Tuesday morning saying, "Isn't Bruce Bochy a great manager?" Where it's clear that he is, right? Talk about, you know, average quality team with one robot, right? One bionic man, Bumgarner, and a bunch of other guys who are sort of average quality, all right? And so 3 times in 5 years he wins the World Series with them, all right? He's obviously terrific. So there's more to the equation than the inherited genetic skills of the players, because we observe that players perform better or worse in different circumstances and with different coaching and with different teammates, all right? So there's more to the problem than this. So this is the last step, and this is what I suspect got you into this group to begin with in many cases. How many of you know Xian, the manager of the basketball team last year?
Yeah.
Only 2 of you. Oh, good. I can talk all about Xian. I was his senior thesis advisor. Xian was a joint major in computer science and economics, who was also the manager of the basketball team. And he got the idea in his junior year to build a computer model of the Stanford basketball team. And here again, it's not economics, because what he was interested in is how the performance of a player varies by circumstance. And the very first problem he attacked was three-point shooting. A very simple problem. What is the three-point shooting average of every player on the team, conditional upon whether they shot it off the dribble or off the pass, and whether they were being guarded, and if they were being guarded, who was guarding them? How good a defensive player was guarding them. And from this, he was able to determine that, for example, all else equal, Chase and Randall made 2 times as many three-pointers from the right side of the court as the left side of the court. This is a very simple fix. Coach Dawkins, tell Chasen to shoot from that side of the court. All right? And sure enough, it worked. Some wonder, why was Stanford so much better in the second half of the season than the first half of the season? In the second half of the season, the coaching was driven by Xian's model. All right? He had given his presentation to the coaches and the players. They loved it. He improved it, and it was actually being used. Now we go back to our productivity model. All right? The next step in the Billy Bean problem is not what are these players' characteristics as they feed into the model, but also what are the improvements in this player's characteristics that I can figure out and you can't. All right? And that is where the frontier is right now. The last two, have any of you been to the MIT Sports Analytics Conference? Well, okay, I trust that one of you should plan to go, right? This is a huge conference held every year about people who are doing the cutting edge of computer modeling in sports. And one of the big frontier issues now is, how do I do something like Xian's done, only much more elaborate, much bigger, much more comprehensive, where the idea is partly, how do I feed the player's skills into the revenue equation and figure out who's a good deal for me given my market? But how do I change those playing statistics? And how do I play them in part? How do I play them in part by individual-like activities, what the player, how the player's skill decomposes by situation, and thereby emphasizing the situations that are positive to his productivity and de-emphasizing the ones that are negative. But in addition to that, how does the synergy work among the players in the team? Who plays well together statistically? What does that even mean? All right, when I put different combinations of people on the floor in basketball, the degree to which that matters is obviously going to differ from sport to sport. But in most sports, it really clearly does matter who else is playing with you, how good you are. And that hasn't been modeled successfully yet. We're right on the frontier. That is the last thing for us to do to get to the final step, which is that professional sports and even college sports become sort of like Silicon Valley software companies, right? That the whole enterprise is run by a bunch of Stanford students. That's it. Our goal is to take over the sports industry like we took over the software industry. And you guys got to contribute. Questions?
Thank you.
There must be stuff, yeah.
I was interested in, you mentioned these consulting firms
Yeah.
that came up around salary arbitration, and this is something that I wasn't aware of historically, so I wanted to ask, were there like dueling consulting firms?
Yes.
Some that were making models biased towards the players and some towards the owners?
Yes, there are players consulting firms and owners consulting firms.
Can you say, like, do you know anything about how these two groups like massage their models at all?
I have steered clear of that completely. The models are proprietary, and the only way you get to know them is to participate in the adversarial process, which I do not do for these salary arbitrations. I know generally how they work and what they do, but nobody actually publishes their model. That's the main difference, of course, between being in the business world and being in the academic world is, you know, when I come up with something new that works, I publish it. But if I were in a consulting firm or or working for Billy Beane, the last thing you do is publish it because it's your comparative advantage in competing with others. So we don't know the details of the structural models. They are testified about in hearings, in arbitration hearings, but those proceedings are sealed by mutual agreement. Both the players and the owners find it in their interest to have this stuff proprietary. And one of the results of this is a really good result, by the way, is that almost nobody completes arbitration anymore. And you'd expect that would be the result. Because as time progresses and you get more and more decisions, you would expect the models to converge. And so the number of circumstances in which the models get a really substantially different prediction is diminishing. And so you wouldn't, you know, once you get down to, you know, a salary arbitration where the player's model says this guy should be paid $7 million and the owner's model says he should be paid $6.5, you say to hell with it, split the difference and walk away. And that almost all arbitration now ends that way. When arbitration first started, over half were decided by the arbitrator. So it's a measure of scientific progress, even though this is all a proprietary closed system. They nonetheless have basically converged. And it's only strange circumstances that produce going to conclusion. So it's an interesting question, but it was a lot more interesting 20 or 30 years ago than it is now, because the models can't be that much different, or else we'd see more arbitration that went to conclusion. Yeah.
Do you know of ways that they've analyzed coaching effectiveness?
Yes.
Like you'll have I guess basketball, coaches like Phil Jackson, they go on teams with superstars, and it's hard to tell is he actually a good coach compared to Rick Carlisle or Greg Popovich, where they have lesser talent, but they.
Yeah, and as you can well imagine, the way you do that is you create a statistical model to predict the outcome of games based purely on the players' characteristics, their playing statistics. And then you see if adding an indicator variable, a dummy variable for the coaches, to the playing statistics is significant. And people have written that paper 4 or 5 times. All right? And the answer is the vast majority of coaches don't matter, but if you do. And that's sort of intuitively right. Phil Jackson matters. All right? Yeah. There are a few that actually matter, but most don't. That matter in the following sense. It's a labor supply issue. It has to do with what does the distribution of coaching skills look like, right? Is it a distribution in which the tail is really, really thin, or a distribution in which the tail is really, really fat? If the distribution has a fat tail, then it's easy to find substitute coaches, right? There's a whole bunch of them out there that are equally good at the tail of distribution. I mean, the number of people who coach is huge compared to the number who coach in the NBA. Likewise, the number of people who coach baseball is huge compared to the number of people who manage in Major League Baseball. So you're looking at this little tiny tail of the distribution out here. If the tail is really, really thin, so that, you know, that if you're looking for say a 2 standard deviation difference, if that 2 standard deviation goes from the extreme value to somebody who's half as good, then indeed you're going to observe a big coaching effect. If the tail is fat, so that it's 1/10 of the standard deviation that gets you from 1 to 30, then it's not going to matter very much. And what seems to be the case is something in the middle. That there are a handful of, at any given time, there are a handful of coaches who are clearly better than everybody else. There's nobody who coaches for a long period of time who's clearly worse than everybody else. But, you know, like in the NFL at any given moment, there'll be 4 or 5 guys that are clearly better, and all the rest are basically the same. And then there's a bunch of substitutes for them that would be basically the same.
I guess how would you evaluate like assistant coaches since you wouldn't be able to track?
Yeah, and there's, unfortunately, there's not enough information in the data for you to be able to separate those effects. And partly because the style of different kinds of coaches in terms of what the role of their assistants is too great. So when you measure the coach, you're also measuring his whole team, right? Because I read an article about this not long ago that was on the web about basically, this obviously can't be true, but there's an insight here that's worth repeating. He said the article took the position there are basically 4 kinds of coaches, and I won't be able to repeat what they are, but I know a couple of them. I remember a couple of them. One of them he characterized as the generalist CEO, the guy who oversees the basic strategy and recruiting, but is not actively involved in day-to-day decision making, who delegates everything. And that guy's success depends completely on the quality of his assistants. But at the same time, he's more likely to get better assistants because you'd rather be an assistant for a coach that lets you do something than one that doesn't. And then there's what he called the pure technician coach, who runs everything himself. And the assistant coaches are glorified water boys. Right? They just carry out his orders, right? And he has a series, and then he has a couple of other